Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you had a good weekend. Okay, so can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
I can, yeah.
Yes, no?
Yes.
Affirmative.
Yes.
Good, okay, very good. And just here in the classroom, we're also waiting to make sure that the screen comes up properly, which it's not, so. Make that show up. Okay. So we've got a few things on the agenda today. So what we're planning to cover today is CSS layout. And some tips for your images in your project, and a brief PHP intro. And then I'm going to have you do some in-class activities where you are actually working on doing some of the layouts that you'll need to do for the web project. And I am figured out I can hold office hours immediately after my 365 class if I do them in Mingal. So I am planning to actually run my office hours starting around 2:35 today. So office hours are run from about 2:35. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is start out with the CSS tips for images. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. A quick question. I went through this iBook and everything, in preparation for this class, and the preprocessors, the SAS, and all that.
Don't worry about them. I'm sorry if I actually assigned SAS. I think I did it mostly to show you that it's there. But okay, go ahead. I shouldn't have interrupted. Go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. I was just curious. So I think I'm already kind of getting your answer. Do you recommend investing the time to using that for this project? Or
no,
something
in
like
fact, I don't want you to. So for the project, in fact, there's a big, I have a big thing saying I don't want you to use any frameworks of any kind. And the reason for that is that I want you to learn kind of the assembly language, so to speak, because you will have to deal with that in the real world. So even when you use frameworks, it's good if you know how to use the underlying HTML and CSS. So there you can see it. You may not use any toolkit, IDE, or framework. So I assigned it. Now I remember I assigned SAS because I wanted you to at least see it. You should know that there are frameworks out there, but I don't want you using it for the project.
Okay. Well, I like the idea of like the variables and stuff like that. Is CSS kind of, I haven't really looked into it that much. Have they like evolved a little bit to kind of allow you to use variables so that I don't have to sit there and change like,
so
the same color over and over again?
Exactly, yes. So CSS has evolved so that you can assign, as you say, they have variables, and therefore if you have a whole bunch of items that you want to have the same color, for example, then you can assign the color to a variable and then just assign that variable to a whole bunch of different items or selectors. So
okay, yeah, I was wondering about it. I was like, man, I hope I don't have to individualize every single Anyway, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
it's not, see, in this project that you're doing for class, it's not big enough that the variables would be all that helpful, but it does get very helpful for much bigger projects.
Okay, that makes
That's
sense.
another reason I'm not letting you use frameworks here. It's not like here you have to do a huge amount of stuff, whereas you would for other, obviously, larger projects.
Okay,
Okay,
sounds good. Thanks, Dr. Ruthie.
you're welcome. Other questions?
On that same topic, they're actually also working on adding nesting to CSS like SAS has. It's going through the W3C like process right now.
Okay, interesting.
That's cool. I like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So so it's interesting because I guess what happens is you try out these ideas often in frameworks, and then they kind of get the best ideas get actually then put into the base layer. That happened with a lot of the inputs in HTML5, like the date picker and the color chooser, file chooser. Those things used to be provided by outside frameworks, and they were deemed so useful that they eventually integrated them directly into the HTML5 standard. So, okay.
The same thing happened with JavaScript as well, where things like CoffeeScript were providing arrow functions and promises and all sorts of stuff that eventually made it into actual JavaScript.
Okay. So, yeah, so it's interesting to see how those things do get, the best ideas do get introduced or incorporated into the base layers. In fact, you're kind of going to see that, I think, today with the layout in CSS. So, so let me just get into a couple things. So you are today going to be doing this layout screen for the project. And you'll notice that these things have rounded edges. You get this with the border radius property. So that is listed in, I think, section 4 of today's CSS chapter, because I think 5 is animations, if I'm not mistaken. So border radius is the property and you can look it up, but that's the property you need for creating rounded corners. And then there's another thing that you're going to be asked to do, which is come up with, whoops. These trash cans that have a white border on a red background, and up here, you're also going to have to do some work with getting the person to be the color you want. So I have provided you with images. So if you look at my image directory on web project, go to IMG, and you can see in that directory, I've given you some icons. So that's what the caret down looks like. Person fill, you'll notice it's not blue. And the trash can, which you'll notice is black, not white. And so you're going to have to do some CSS tricks to make those things appear in the right way. And I have done something that can help. So there is what is called the CSS filter property, and I don't really want to force you to play around a whole lot with it. So let me So I have, first I'm just going to show you, done my own thing to get, notice I've gotten a blue person and here a white trash can on a red background. And the way you can do that is with some fancy footwork with CSS. So you can see here with the trash can, I give it a class, could have given it an ID too. And first I use the filter property to invert it. So that turns the black to white and the white to black, which was necessary. But then that's not exactly what I wanted, right? I wanted inversion, but I wanted it to be white on red. So you'll notice here that I used a background color of aqua, not red. The reason I used a background color of aqua is that it turned out when you put the trash can, inverted trash can, and display it using a background color of aqua, you actually get what you see over here, which is a white trash can on a red background. And I'm not going to go into why all this happens, just, and then I set the width to a 1/4 of an inch and it worked well. So feel free to copy this for the project, because otherwise you may find yourself wasting a lot of time trying to make it happen. And then for the person, you can see again, I used a filter, and the person was originally black and I want it to be blue. So I started with inverting it by a certain amount and then saying sepia 1. And what that did is it converted the black actually to brown. It did not convert it to blue. What converted it then to blue was when I did a hue rotate by 180 degrees. And that ended up rotating it from brown to blue. Then the brightness, I made it 60% on a scale from 0 to 100%. So you notice it's not super bright. If I see if I can bring up the, I'm going to see if I can't make the width, the height a bit bigger here.
Dr. VZ, where did you get the icon from? I'm looking around trying to find
these
that trash can
from, I believe, the free icon library or something. I forget, I did it last year, so I can try to figure out where I got them and post it on Piazza. It was a free catalog of such things. So I don't think it's from the Bootstrap catalog. I think it's from another one. I'll try to find it, okay, and post it, because they have a whole lot of useful icons like this.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So it can be fun to just play with it. Like I changed the brightness, I'll make it 100%. See, it's a lighter color of blue now. So I wanted a deeper color of blue, so I took some of the brightness away. So reload that. So then saturate. Saturate is how much white is in it. The more white that's in it, like with red, the more white you add to red, the pinker it appears. So saturation refers to how much white is in there. So add a whole lot more saturation. And basically I knocked out all the white. Okay, so it turned it back to looking black. If I say 0 saturation, should, I think, turn it all white, but I'm not 100% sure. Not quite, it just made it very light. Okay, so you can play with these things to get different results, but I'm quite happy for you to use the styles that you see right here to style your trash can and your person, because it took me a while to play with these parameters to get them there. And I don't expect you to be a sophisticated graphic artist for this project. So that's why I'm giving you these CSS styles. Okay. So questions about that? Actually, I will admit I cannot, if you start saying exactly what is sepia, you're going to hear me stammer and stutter because I looked it up once, figured it out, and now forgot it again. Okay. So,
I have a question.
oh, go ahead.
Would it be fine to inline the SVG and then we can style it using SVG things like fill and stroke?
You can do that, yes. Anything that you can do to make it work, I'm fine with.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Just make sure that when we use what we had a problem last time with opening up the projects and the images not being there. So make sure whatever you do that those images are included with your submission. Okay, whether you use my SVGs or your own, just make sure that they're copied and embedded, okay, with your project. Okay, other questions? Okay, so then just quickly, CSS is very good with doing horizontal layout, but not so good with doing, it's good horizontally, and historically, bad vertically. Now that's changing because they realize that people really do want to be able to do things with vertical alignment, like center things in a box. Originally, the feeling was, well, we know the width of a viewport screen, okay? So it's fine to, like, say, center something in the middle of the viewport. But instead of thinking that a page only extended down to the bottom of the viewport, the idea was that a page was infinite length or infinite height, and therefore it made no sense to center something in something that had infinite height, and therefore they didn't really provide ways to easily vertically align things. Now, I think they've learned that people really do want to be able to vertically align objects, and so they are doing things like they've introduced these viewpoint width, viewpoint height measures that allow you to basically specify a percent of the viewport height or width. And also, they are introducing layouts like layout managers like Flex or Flexbox and the grid layout that also allow you to vertically align things. So they've gotten much better about doing vertical alignment than they used to. It used to be you really resorted to table layouts because you could do vertical alignment in a table cell. But that's usually frowned upon for doing layout. You want to separate the content from the layout, and table is really saying this thing has a table structure rather than that's the layout structure we want. So just like we were talking about how things have gotten into the standard, let's just kind of go to Zybooks for a moment. So it turns out that Flexbox looks a lot like the flow layout manager in Java, and grid layout looks a lot like the grid layout manager in Java. So it would not surprise me if the developers of CSS did not get their inspiration from the layout managers that were being already used in Java. And I highly recommend that you use one of these two layout managers for laying out your web interface. In fact, that's your in-class assignment today, is going to be using each of these two layout managers to lay things out. So I think you should be able to pretty much do all the layout in your project pretty much using a Flexbox or grid layouts. Now, the older CSS, you had to use the position property a lot more frequently, especially in order to do vertical alignment. I really would rather you not use the position property, if possible, in your assignments, just because I find the behavior to be pretty unpredictable. I have myself, I find that it takes a lot of expertise in order to use it well. Now, there is one thing that is can be useful, and that is fixed positioning. When you want to hold a header or a nav bar in the right place. So for example, I'm not going to be a stickler for it, but you'll notice here that this header disappears when I move up. And you also notice that this nav bar is moving up. And if I scroll enough, the nav bar will disappear. And that may be undesirable. You may actually wish for the header and the nav bar to always appear and in effect be stuck to the same part of the viewport. So that is a time where you might want to use the fixed positioning for a box, because that will keep it fixed no matter whether you scroll the page up or down, it will always stay in the same place. But normally you would only do that for things on the side or the top, perhaps the bottom too. The things in the middle, you typically would not want to use fixed positioning for. And then these other things like relative positioning, positions the element relative to to the element's default position. Pretty much you should be able to achieve that with the various alignment commands that are given to you by the grid layout and Flexbox manager. So you really shouldn't have to do relative positioning, in my opinion, anymore. So I would not worry a whole lot about it. The same thing in chapter 4, you saw float left and float right. And again, that's a little bit dangerous to use. So the float property, and you can float something left or float something right. And that's something that's tempting to do in the project, because you'll notice here on the header, this ABET logo is floated left apparently, and this looks like it's floated right. But there's ways you can do that with alignment in both the Flexbox and the grid box. It doesn't require floating. And the problem with floating is the objects aren't considered part of the box for purposes of computing width and height. So you can actually end up with nothing appearing on the screen when you float this icon left and this icon right, because there's nothing else in the box. So when the box's height and width are computed, they're computed as 0, 0, and nothing shows up. And there's a way to deal with that, but I think it's called overflow hidden. But it's just, what I'm saying is float introduces issues that can trip you up. So again, probably better not to use it if you can avoid it. It works well, for example, with images that you want to embed in text, and you want the images to flow around the text to flow around the images. Then you might specify that the image should float left or float right in a column. That's a little bit different. Okay. Then in sections 5.4, the special effects, don't worry about, again, I wanted you to know about them and I want you to do some exercises with them. In the project, they're not really going to be that important except for the border radius. So you should know about rounded corners, and that's in section 5.4. 5.5 with animations, again, nice to know, but the animations that you do, I think, are going to be easier to do with JavaScript. So in the web project, you're going to be fading in and fading out some error messages. And I think it's easier to use JavaScript style animation than CSS style animation. And then the styling forms, very helpful, I think, for you when you're doing your projects. So 5.1, 5.2, and 5.6 are where you really need to focus your attention for doing styling.
That's, you said 5.1, 2, and 6?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. In fact, I think rather than moving into PHP, which is kind of a non sequitur right here, instead what I'm going to do is move ahead with, there's no quiz today, so I think what I'm going to do is defer talking about PHP until Thursday, and instead have you do the in-class exercises that I wanted done today. So let's get back to so what I have, if you go to my lecture notes, you will find that there are these three images, and we'll go with flex.jpg. So you can see this actually mimics the layout you need to do for the web project. You'll have UTK abed up here on the left. You'll have the person with a caret here. You'll have a navigation bar here, and then you'll have the main window here. And what I want you to do is basically use first a flex box and then a grid box in order to create these images. So I have given you flex.html, and you can see right now it just gives you the labels for the different areas. So what I want you to do is to add CSS styling using a flex box. So that's your first assignment today, is to style these things using a flex box to do it. And you can either copy it from my directory. So the directory, second. Okay, if you go to, on the Hydra machines, B van der Zee, CS465 lectures, CSS advanced, and you copy the files out of there, then you should get the HTML files that you need, plus the JPEGs to look at. So that's one way to get them. The other is just to look at the page source. So this is one way, is to copy the files on the Hydra machines from here. Another, you can just go on your computer, and if you know how to get at the page source, you can just copy the page source. And I already have the style sheet started for you. And so what you're doing is just adding the necessary Flexbox commands to do the layout. You shouldn't have to touch anything down here in the HTML. You should just be able to add stuff to the style. So I'm going to give you about 15 minutes. Feel free to work with a friend on this over Zoom. Feel free to ask questions at any time, and we'll reconvene about 12:15 and I'll show you the solution.
Is that flex.html on your on the lecture page, the schedule?
Yeah, it is flex.html on the lecture page. So
awesome,
back,
thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, so on the lecture page, it's flex.html.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, I know most of you probably have not been able to finish it, and that's fine. It could easily probably take you to fine tune everything more than a couple hours possibly or more playing with it, which is why I wanted to actually kind of show you how to do it, because you can maybe get the rough sketch fairly easily, but it's sometimes a little harder to get the fine details. So this is what we want. And the way I handled it was I first said, okay, let me create one flex box with two elements with a column direction. So with a header and kind of like a main body. So that was Flexbox 1. And it used a column direction. And I gave 10% to the header and 90% of the space to the main body. Then I used a Flexbox for the header and for the main body. And each of those were a row direction. So for the header flex box, I used a row direction. And you're going to see that what I did was took advantage of something called the, you can space things so that space is put between them. So we'll see that. So it ended up shoving the profile over here, and it ended up putting the UTK ABET over here. So you're going to see that there's a spacing between or spacing around that allows you to do that. And then down here in the main body, I again used a flex box to divide it into a sections and instructions. So the main body flex box was also row directed. Okay, and then I did some things to get the labels centered. So that's the high level idea. 3 flex boxes, one to create the vertical alignment, then one each for the header and the main body.
Dr. VC, just out of curiosity, I was thinking about using 2 rows and like just creating 2 containers. I guess that would be what, 2 flex boxes? Just use a row one for the header and profile.
Yes,
And then
but
use
then I'm
one.
not sure how you're going to get the screen allocation between them. Seems like you then
Oh,
need
right.
a parent container to indicate how those 2 rows should be managed.
That makes sense together, right? As one unit. Okay.
Right.
That
So
makes sense.
that's why I did it the way I did it.
Okay.
So if you look at my solution, so the body, this is where I displayed it using the column. I said the height was 100%, so I was taking 100% of the viewport and 95% of the width of the viewport. I could have said 100%, but you notice I put in this margin here to create a little bit of margin on either side. Hence, I couldn't make the width be 100%. Then the container is what contains the instruction and the section. So if I go down and you look at container, you'll see it's a div that contains the nav and the main sections. So I made that container a flex with a row direction. And then this one is referring to the parent. So interestingly enough, these 2 instructions refer to the children. This is referring to the parent and saying, okay, I want to take 90% of the space at my natural height. And then this is what's called the shrink factor, and this is the grow factor. So if it grows, it wants to basically, there's computations that are done when it's resized to indicate how much space is allocated to different things. So for example, if one had a grow factor of 3 and the other had a grow factor of 1, then when they grows, the one with the grow factor of 3 should get 3/4 of the additional space, and the one with the grow factor of 1 should get 1/4 of the additional space. So these are kind of arbitrary things here that indicate what to do when you shrink it, what to do when you grow it, and then what it should appear at naturally when you first lay it out. Okay.
Dr. PC, can I see your HTML one more time?
Yes. So this is the container object for the section and the instructions.
Oh, thank you. I'm taking screenshots. So
okay. Welcome. Okay. So then the header had a remaining one where it takes 10% of the vertical space. Remember, it's a column direction, so what you're specifying there is the vertical space. And then again, it's displaying its elements using a flex box in the row direction. And you'll see these 2 lines, this one, the space between, is what allowed me to shove the UTK logo to the left and the profile to the right. So the space between says put an equal amount of space between the items. Well, in this case, there was only 2 items. So by using space between, I actually caused the left item to be shoved up against the left border and the right item to be shoved up against the right border. And then I wanted them centered vertically. So align items allows me to vertically center. the labels. So that ended up, align items is what vertically centered them. And then the background color was light gray, and I used some padding just so that they wouldn't be shoved right up against the border. So if we look at the solution, you'll notice there's a little padding here. That's what the padding left and the padding right is doing, is it's stopping it from being shoved right against the border. It gives us a little bit of padding. So the align item center is what's getting the labels to be centered. And then the justify content is what is aligning them horizontally. Okay, so that's what's going on with the header. So then I want to lay out these two, the section and the main. So there, the nav is going to take 20% of the width, and the main is going to take 80% of the width. And I put some padding on top again so that notice there's a little bit of padding here so that the section isn't crunched right up against the boundary here. And then I made it light blue. And same thing, main, made it light green. So that is where you get this right here. And let's see, how did I center these things? The centering I just did using HTML. So there I just centered the two items using HTML. And then you'll notice with the ABET and the profile, I gave them flexes, and it turned out I shouldn't need this anymore. This align item center, I think, and text align right. Let's see if I can take those out or if I really needed them. Actually, it looks like I might need them because it looks like profile is, yes, I know what's happening. So taking out the align right didn't work out. So I can show you why using borders. So I'm going to put a border around here, make it 2 pixels, black, solid. So you see it worked. The spacing between did actually shove the profile block all the way to the right, but I don't know how much space is going to be needed for the profile. So I said it would take 30%. I can't figure out exactly what it will take because there's no easy way to calculate the width of this profile label. So I simply over allocated space for it. But then even though its block is right aligned, the text is still left aligned inside the block. And so I had to then still say text align right in order to force the label over to the right side of the box. So these borders are really convenient for debugging, for figuring out what's going wrong. So just like you use print statements for debugging normally, I use borders to debug with my graphical user interfaces. Okay, so that takes care of this one. And I will make this available so that you can have a look-see at it. Any quick questions? Because I do want to move on to the grid one just to show you that one. Okay, so in that case, what I'd like you to do is try to reproduce the grid one. So it's the same, basically take the same file except now use a grid layout to line this up rather than using a Flexbox layout. So take a few minutes, 10 minutes on this one, because I want to have 5 minutes to go over the solution. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the solution that I use for my grid layout. So I want something that looks like this. I'm using some borders to illustrate where everything ended up lined up. So I just chose to use a 2x2 grid here. I had the header spanning the top 2 columns, and then the section and instructions being the second row, each of them occupying 1 column in the second row. So I indicate that the body is displayed as a grid layout, and that the columns, the first column will take 20% of the width, the second column will take the remaining width, so I made it auto. And then with the rows, I made, the header take 10% of the vertical height, and then the second row takes the remaining height, so again I made it auto. Use grid template areas then to lay out a fixed layout like this. If you want a more dynamic layout, you could specify columns and rows as the book showed you, but this is a fixed layout. So the header is going to span both columns. Nav and main will be on the second row. And you can see you have to name your blocks. So here in header, I named it using the grid area property. So that's the relationship between this head and this head. Same thing if you look at nav, you'll see I called it grid area nav. So that's how you're getting that linking. So then in the header, it itself was displayed as a grid, a 1 row, 2 column grid. So in this case, I wanted the 2 blocks to take up an equal amount of space, hence auto and auto. And there's just 1 row. I put abed on the left side, profile on the right side. So now coming down to abed, this is something cute you can do. You can display a single block as a grid, a 1x1 grid, and you don't have to specify how things are laid out. It's just assumed to be a 1x1 grid, and then you can do vertical alignment, which is what I did here. Align items. You'll notice that UTK abed is aligned vertically. For profile, I also displayed it as a grid, but I also have to justify the items on the right side. If I don't, if I take it out, I comment it out and display it, it pops over to the left because by default everything is displayed on the left side, but by using justify items I can force the content to be displayed on the right side. Then going down to nav, you'll notice that I also am displaying it as a 1x1 grid, and rather than using center in the HTML to center the items, I just use the justify items to cause the centering to occur. And I'm still using this padding on the top of the nav to force a little bit of space here. Same thing for main. I'm using padding top to force a little bit of space here as well. And again, I'm using borders. You'll notice that I am displaying things with borders to help me debug. So just like I use print statements debugging a text program, I tend to use borders to do debugging with a graphical program. So grid is a pretty powerful tool because it lays things out in 2 dimensions. A Flexbox, by contrast, lays things out more one-dimensionally, but because Flexbox can wrap, Flexbox is still capable of laying things out two-dimensionally, but you have less control over how things wrap. Basically, a Flexbox will lay out things until it hits the right border, and then if it can't fit it on that row anymore, it will now drop down to a second row. So it doesn't have as much control as the grid layout. On the other hand, the grid layout tends to be a bit more complicated. So both are helpful. And just a quick summary with these display managers. So they're laying out the children in a container. So for example, if this parent here has children 1, children 2, children n, and I say that its display is grid, then a grid layout lays out its n children. You don't have to specify the same layout manager for a child. So if this child is itself a container with these, say, buttons, then it could use a flex layout manager to lay them out. So each container can use its own layout manager to lay out its children. Okay, so with that, we pretty much finish up with CSS. Thursday, we start into PHP, which is going to allow us to start doing computations on the server side, and as we'll see, also to generate dynamic web content. So I will see you all on Thursday.